Deployment orders and a stolen home. Morning I left for Afghanistan. The air outside my modest Texas home felt unusually still, as if the universe knew I was about to be uprooted. My boots clicked with precision across the driveway, my duffel bag slung over my shoulder, tightly packed with everything I would need for the next 9 months in a place where time moved slower and every sunrise could be your last. I turned back just once to look at the little single-story house I had bought with every dime I earned from previous deployments. My neighbor, Mrs. Paley, waved from her porch with her usual warm smile, unaware that what waited back home was a betrayal far deeper than anything I would face in the war zone. I was Staff Sergeant Caleb Monroe, part of the 101st Airborne. I had served 3 tours before this one. The Army had hardened my body, sharpened my mind, and thickened my skin, but what it had never prepared me for was how people back home could betray a soldier's trust in ways no enemy ever could. My home wasn't just a place to rest my head. It was a sanctuary, a place of healing after the battles were over. I had purchased it in good faith, paid every HOA fee on time, mowed my lawn every Saturday, and even attended their ridiculous monthly meetings when I could. And yet, none of that mattered in the end. The deployment went as deployments often do, grueling, emotionally numbing, filled with camaraderie, loss, and moments of clarity that only come when you're thousands of miles from everything familiar. I led my platoon through villages, deserts, and outposts. We shared stories under stars, covered each other's backs during ambushes, and mourned the loss of 2 of our own. Yet amid all of that, I clung to one thought: my home, my peaceful, quiet home with the cedar fence and the little garden I planted with my sister before she passed. It was the image I returned to every night when I closed my eyes, the symbol of everything I was fighting for. But the real war, the one that shook me to my core, was waiting quietly back in Texas. I returned 9 months later, dusty, weary, and desperate to breathe familiar air. I didn't tell anyone I was coming back a few days early. I wanted to surprise my mom, visit my sister's grave, and sit on my porch with a cold drink before I rejoined civilian life. When the Uber pulled up to the curb, I froze. There were cars in the driveway, 3 of them. The porch swing I had installed with my cousin was gone, replaced by some modern metal thing that did not belong. There were kids' toys strewn across the lawn, and worst of all, there was a big, garish for lease sign propped against the mailbox, with a contact number from a local real estate agency. At first, I thought I had the wrong house. I checked the address twice, but then a stranger opened the door. A man in his mid-30s, wearing board shorts and a tank top, stared at me like I was the intruder. "Can I help you?" he asked, brows furrowed. "I live here," I said, my voice calm but tense. "This is my house." He laughed. No, man. We've been renting this place for 6 months. The HOA manages it." I stepped back. The words hit harder than any blast I had faced in combat. The HOA, the Homeowners Association I paid dues to, the one whose president I had personally spoken to before deployment, had rented out my house. I felt my knees weaken. I barely heard the rest of what the guy was saying, something about a property manager, some lease agreement. My ears rang with rage and disbelief. I had never given permission for my home to be rented. I had not signed a lease. My belongings, where were they? My medals, my photographs, my journals from past tours. I left without another word. I sat in my truck for hours, trying to make sense of it. Every phone call I made hit a dead end. The property management company told me they had a legal lease from the HOA. The HOA refused to take my calls. My belongings, placed into storage, they claimed. No receipts, no storage address, no explanation. They had taken everything from me. That night, I called my former commanding officer, Major James Whitaker, a man I had served with in Iraq and who now worked in security consulting. I didn't call him for vengeance, I called him for guidance. But when I explained what happened, he went silent. Then he said, "You're not going to fight this alone, Caleb." Over the next 72 hours, 5 of my closest brothers in arms rolled into town, each one a man I had shared foxholes, firewatch, and fierce loyalty with. There was Marcus, the quiet sniper who had a lawyer for a wife, Darren, who had transitioned into real estate law. Diego, a former medic who now worked for a security logistics firm, and Lenny, the bulldozer from Brooklyn who could talk his way into or out of anything. We didn't storm in with weapons or threats. No, this wasn't a war zone. This was something more delicate. We were going to reclaim my home with law, honor, and strategy. But first, I needed to remember exactly who I was and why I fought. I was not just a soldier. I was a homeowner, a citizen. And the HOA had made the fatal mistake of thinking I would be easy to trample over. They were about to learn that a platoon may leave the battlefield, but the battlefield never leaves the platoon. And the real battle for justice was just beginning. The hidden lease and the HOAS game Plankleb had always believed that America stood for justice. That if you played by the rules, paid your dues, and gave back to your country, you would be protected. But the cold, tangled web of deceit that had been spun by his HOA told him otherwise. Sitting in an old diner off County Road 74, with the scent of burnt coffee and bacon lingering in the air, he and his former platoon members pored over every scrap of paperwork they could obtain. Darren, who now wore a tailored blazer in place of his old fatigues, laid out printed pages on the tabletop with surgical precision. His finger tapped against a document stamped with an unfamiliar seal, one Caleb had never signed, never seen, and certainly never agreed to. This, Darren said firmly, is the lease agreement they've been hiding. It's fake, or at least, it's built on a foundation of assumptions and loopholes. Caleb leaned forward, his jaw clenched. The document stated that the HOA had the right to manage abandoned properties in the neighborhood to preserve community value. The clause was vague, loosely defined, and open to wide interpretation, and it had been slipped into an HOA bylaw amendment passed during a meeting that Caleb, like several other deployed homeowners, had obviously not attended. They had taken silence as consent. They had used his absence, a sacrifice made in the name of national duty, as a technicality to seize control of his home. And they had done it with cold precision. But there was more. The management company, Fairhold Property Partners, was not a neutral third-party firm. Marcus had tracked them to a P.O. box in San Antonio, a shell company, a ghost entity with one paper trail leading directly back to none other than Mr. Clifton J. Barber, the sitting president of the HOA, a man who once shook Caleb's hand at a community barbecue and thanked him for his service, while simultaneously orchestrating the rental of his home behind his back. It was not just theft. It was betrayal wrapped in legalese. Whitaker, who had arrived that morning from Houston with a face full of quiet fury, tapped his cane against the floor with the controlled rhythm of a battlefield. "Commander, they didn't expect you to come home early," he said. "They thought you'd be out of the picture long enough for their dirty little lease to run its course. It's not about money, Caleb. It's about control. HOA control. And they picked the wrong man to play this game." With outside, the sun had begun to dip behind the horizon, casting a fiery glow over the edge of the diner window. But inside, there was a storm brewing, one that would soon sweep through that community like a force they had never seen. And it would not come with guns or intimidation. It would come with precision, with calm, and with a code of honor that men like Clifton Barber had long forgotten. The platoon spent the next 2 days turning Caleb's rented-out home into a case study. Marcus, quiet and methodical, used a commercial drone to take high-definition footage of the property, documenting every alteration, every unauthorized modification, every moment the tenants let their children dig up Caleb's carefully planted flower bed. Diego helped Caleb file a police report, marking the issue as disputed occupation of property with potential fraud, while Darren worked with a legal team out of Austin that specialized in property rights for veterans. They didn't make noise, not yet, but they watched. And in the middle of it all, Caleb visited his storage unit, or rather, the one the HOA claimed they had used. After 2 hours of driving in circles, calling the provided number, and chasing leads that went nowhere, he stood in front of an abandoned unit behind an old tire warehouse. The padlock was broken. Inside, his belongings were thrown into plastic bins like garbage. His mother's framed photograph had a crack through the middle. His sister's final letter to him was half soaked in water from a leak in the ceiling. His Army commendations were warped from heat damage. Caleb did not speak. He stood in the middle of the mess, took one long breath, and whispered, "They think this is just about a house. They don't understand it's about everything that was ever sacred to me." That night, the platoon regrouped in Caleb's temporary rental. The mood was quiet, but no one was defeated. In fact, they were sharpening. Diego revealed a contact in the local press who had a history of exposing HOA corruption. Whitaker spoke to a retired judge he had once served within the JAG Corps, who agreed to review the lease documents for irregularities. Lenny, with his Brooklyn charm, made friends with the tenants in Caleb's old house and began asking questions. "They think it's a vacation rental," he said. "They're from Minnesota. They were told this was a temporary property owned by an investment firm. They paid up front. No idea it belongs to you." That gave Caleb the one thing he needed most, leverage. He did not blame the tenants. He blamed the system that enabled the deception. But before any legal motions could be filed, before any public statement could be made, they had to find the smoking gun, the one undeniable piece of evidence that would show this was never a mistake, that it was premeditated, and they did. Buried deep in HOA board meeting minutes from 8 months ago, Marcus discovered a handwritten side note in the margins of a PDF scan. It read, "Monroe property unoccupied, green light for short-term lease. No resistance expected. Owner unreachable until Q4. That sentence burned through Caleb's chest like a live wire. They had known exactly what they were doing. There was no doubt now. The president and his small inner circle had targeted properties of active duty soldiers who were not present to defend themselves. It was not just about Caleb, it was systemic. Caleb's case was just the one that happened to strike the heart of a man with a team of disciplined, intelligent, and determined brothers. From that point forward, it was no longer just personal. It was a mission. The press was looped in, quietly. At first, a human interest angle. Soldier returns home. Finds house rented out by HOA without consent. The article was scheduled to go live the following week. The legal paperwork was nearly ready. Caleb would file an injunction, demand a hearing, and press charges for unlawful possession and property damage. But the final nail in the coffin came from the most unexpected source, an elderly woman named Mrs. Paley, the same neighbor who had waved to him the morning he deployed. She knocked on his door that evening, holding a worn-out folder and tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry, Caleb," she said softly. "I didn't know how bad it had gotten, but I kept everything. Every notice, every change they posted while you were gone. I even recorded one of the board meetings they held in secret. I thought it might be important someday." Inside the folder was gold. Emails, hand-delivered notices, timestamps, and most shockingly a video where Clifton Barber openly joked during a meeting, "These deployment houses are just sitting there. Why not make some use of them? It's not like they're coming back anytime soon." The men sat in stunned silence. But Caleb, he smiled, a slow, burning smile that said everything. Not of vengeance, not of hatred, but of justice finally getting its time to breathe. The mission was clear now. They would not storm in. They would not kick down doors. They would dismantle the corruption brick by brick, legally, peacefully, powerfully. And it would begin with the letter they drafted that night, a letter addressed to every homeowner in the community. A letter that would shake the very foundation of the HOA. The letter that turned the neighborhood. The letter was never meant to be a declaration of war. It was, in its essence, a torch held high in the darkness. A quiet plea for justice wrapped in a soldier's dignity. Caleb Monroe sat at the dining table of his rented duplex, shoulders straight, pen in hand. With the silent weight of 6 men surrounding him, the air felt thick, charged not with anger, but with conviction. They had uncovered corruption, manipulation, and deception. And now it was time to do something most dangerous to the powerful. Tell the truth. The kind of truth that does not need embellishment or dramatics to shake the ground it lands on. They were not going to shout. They were going to speak clearly, directly, and unapologetically. And they would do it by telling the community what their HOA had done. In Caleb's own words, "Dear neighbors," the letter began, "My name is Caleb Monroe. You might know me as the guy who mowed his lawn every Saturday before sunrise. Or maybe you've seen me walking my late sister's dog along Maple Bend Lane. I've lived in this community for 6 years, I deployed overseas last October. When I returned 2 weeks ago, I found strangers living in my home I legally purchased, fully paid off home. The HOA had rented it out while I was serving this country. That first paragraph was more than enough to stop hearts mid-beat. But Caleb continued, telling the story not with vengeance, but with restraint and grace. He mentioned the forged lease agreement, the secret meetings, and the forgotten veterans whose names appeared again and again in the board's decisions. He wrote not only for himself but for the silent voices, who never made it home to find out what had been done to their property in their absence. Caleb concluded with a simple question, one that pierced through every yard line and white picket fence in the neighborhood. Is this the community we wanted to build, one where power preys on the absent and those who serve are rewarded with eviction? The letter was distributed one envelope at a time, placed carefully into mailboxes by Whitaker, Lenny, Diego, and Marcus over the course of 2 nights. No grand announcements, no angry knocks, no confrontation, just words backed by evidence. And those words did more damage to the HOA than any lawsuit or public hearing ever could, because those words planted something terrifying in the hearts of the neighbors. Doubt. The next morning, a ripple of discomfort moved through the neighborhood, like an invisible wind. Front doors opened a little slower. Conversations became whispers. Mrs. Tran, who always defended the HOA as strict but fair, stared at her envelope for 10 full minutes before finally reading it. Mr. Dawkins, a retired firefighter who once volunteered at HOA barbecues, paced his driveway, gripping the letter until the paper curled in his hand. No one spoke out loud, but the silence screamed. That very afternoon, the HOA board scheduled an emergency meeting, but Clifton Barber, the president himself, was nowhere to be found. Inside his lavish corner lot home, he remained silent, unreachable. The board scrambled, issuing a clumsy, defensive email dismissing Caleb's claims as misunderstandings caused by deployment miscommunication. But it was too late. People had seen the documents. They had read the quote. They had watched the video clip of Barber laughing about deployment homes and calling them easy pickings. The board's statement only made things worse. That what followed was not chaos, it was awakening. Neighbors began digging through their own records. One homeowner discovered that her service member brother's house had also been placed on the HOA's vacant list, though it had never been rented out yet. Another man, a former Navy corpsman, realized that the HOA had altered the landscaping rules during his absence and fined him retroactively upon return. These weren't isolated events. They were part of a quiet campaign of exploitation, targeting the absent, the unaware, and those least able to fight back. Veterans, elderly, long-haul truckers, even grieving widows. Caleb and his team didn't celebrate. They doubled down. Whitaker began collecting written statements. Darren compiled timelines, financials, and internal correspondence, preparing for a civil complaint. Marcus ran analytics on the vote records, uncovering that many key decisions had been made in meetings with less than a third of the homeowners present, often held on weekday afternoons with no public announcement. Diego found at least 4 residents who admitted they voted blindly because they were told it was just procedural paperwork. What had started as a personal violation had now become a communal reckoning. Within days, a group of residents began circulating a petition for a full audit of the HOA. A second petition followed, this one demanding a vote of no confidence in the board. And then came the third, the loudest of all, a petition calling for the immediate removal of President Clifton Barber. And yet, Barber remained silent. It was not until the 10th day after the letter that Barber emerged. He called an open forum, his first in over a year, to address the falsehoods and preserve the HOA's integrity. The meeting was held in the community center gymnasium, and Caleb, though invited, arrived quietly, sitting near the back, surrounded by men who had once cleared villages and shielded children from mortar fire. The room was packed, not with rage, but with expectation. Barber stood behind a wooden podium, his suit immaculate, his smile rehearsed. He opened with vague comments about rumors and misinformation. He made veiled references to outside influences stirring up division. But when he said, We have always acted in the best interest of this community. The crowd shifted, whispers turned into murmurs, and then a voice rang out. You said Monroe's home was abandoned. That's a lie. It was Mr. Dawkins, standing tall in the aisle. You knew he was deployed. You knew. Barber faltered, but tried to regain control. Sir, this is not the format. Answer him. Someone else shouted. You used a fake lease. Where's the money? A third yelled. Where? Did the rental income go? Barber's voice cracked. He tried to speak, but no one was listening anymore. That was when Caleb rose not to shout, but to speak. He walked to the front slowly, nodded respectfully to the residents, then turned to Barber. I trusted this community. I trusted this board. I gave everything I had to this country, and when I came home, I was homeless by your hand. Not by accident, not by misunderstanding, by calculated decisions. His voice never rose. It did not need to. You targeted us, the deployed, the voiceless, the invisible. But we're not invisible anymore. The room erupted. Not in chaos, but in applause. It was not the kind of applause you hear at rallies or protests. It was deeper, raw, from the gut, the sound of people reclaiming their dignity. Barber left the meeting early, escorted by a board member who looked as pale as a ghost. That night, a vote was held, and in the quiet corners of kitchens and porches all over the neighborhood, ballots were signed, boxes were ticked, and for the first time in years, the HOA trembled. Because justice had knocked not with fists, but with truth. The fall of Barber and the storm that followed. Vote tally came in quietly, not with cheers or grand announcements, but with the low hum of confirmation. It arrived in the form of an email sent to every homeowner, issued by the HOA secretary, who after days of silence had finally chosen to do what was right. The subject line read, Board vote results, motion to remove President Clifton Barber. Below it, the numbers spoke volumes. Out of 312 eligible voters in the community, 227 had voted, and of those, 204 had checked the box for immediate removal. Barber was ousted. No appeals, no drawn-out process. He had been dethroned not by force, but by the very community he thought he controlled. But the storm his reign had summoned did not dissipate with his fall. It merely shifted, gathering power and urgency as the remaining homeowners began to realize how deeply the roots of his corruption ran. The HOA board was no longer a fortress of control. It was a crumbling castle of fear and secrets. The vice president, a man named Harold Kinley, resigned that same evening, citing health reasons. 2 more board members followed within 48 hours, and what remained was a half-empty table, shaky, vulnerable, exposed, and still, it wasn't over. Not even close, because Barber had done more than rent out Caleb's home. He had rerouted funds. He had signed off on maintenance contracts with shell companies. He had imposed penalties that had no basis in the HOA's bylaws, then waived them selectively for those who remained loyal. Darren, who had become the unofficial legal counsel for the now mobilized neighborhood, filed the first formal audit request the very next morning. It was accompanied by a detailed brief, including financial discrepancies, duplicate invoices, and a report tracing more than $38,000 in unaccounted HOA fees. The petition was signed by 117 residents in just 2 days. Suddenly, homeowners who once never looked beyond their own front lawn were attending public meetings, reviewing bylaws, requesting board minutes, and scrutinizing every expenditure. People were waking up not just to what had happened, but to the responsibilities they had long left in the hands of others. But Caleb knew that removing Barber was only the beginning. The structure that allowed him to operate unchecked was still intact. The rules were vague. The oversight was non-existent. And the culture, the one that whispered, just follow along, don't ask questions, was still present in the corners of the neighborhood. If they truly wanted justice, it wasn't enough to dismantle Barber's grip. They needed to rebuild the system from within. He began meeting with residents, not just the vocal ones, but the quiet ones. The single mothers juggling 3 jobs. The elderly who had stopped attending meetings years ago because they felt their voices were never heard. The veterans who, like Caleb, had returned to find their homes changed and their trust shaken. He listened, not as a soldier giving orders, but as a man with scars and a story, someone who had tasted betrayal and decided it would not define him, the community responded. Volunteers stepped forward to run for the board. Among them were people who had never thought of themselves as leaders: an elementary school teacher, a retired nurse, a young father with a background in accounting. They didn't want power. They wanted transparency. They wanted peace. Caleb supported them, not with grand speeches, but with steady presence, helping them understand how to read financial statements, draft motions, and build consensus. And slowly, a new board began to take shape. But just as things seemed to be healing, the true extent of Barbara's shadow came to light. 3 days after the audit request was filed, Marcus, who had been working behind the scenes tracing HOA payments, uncovered a series of wire transfers. They weren't just routed through Fairhold Property Partners. They connected to a second LLC, Barber Asset Holdings, incorporated in Nevada, with Clifton's signature on the registration, the same company that received payment for security upgrades that were never installed. And it got worse. The storage unit where Caleb's belongings were dumped, it had been paid for using HOA emergency maintenance funds. The access code was logged under a board member's credentials. It was not negligence, it was embezzlement. With this new evidence, Darren filed a formal complaint with the Texas Attorney General's office. Simultaneously, the local news station that had first interviewed Caleb months earlier released a follow-up segment. Veterans HOA Nightmare. New evidence suggests widespread fraud. The story exploded. Suddenly, this wasn't just a neighborhood dispute, it was a statewide scandal. And while Barber had disappeared from the public eye, the legal wheels had begun to turn. Subpoenas were issued. The community center was searched. Caleb's letter was quoted in online forums, news broadcasts, even veterans organizations across the country. And with every step forward, Caleb remained grounded, not because he sought vengeance, but because he remembered the broken frame of his mother's picture in that storage unit. He remembered the tear-stained letter from his sister, the metals warped by negligence, and the silence of an empty home that should have welcomed him back. It wasn't about taking revenge on Barber. It was about restoring the honor that Barber tried to bury. Amid the chaos, something beautiful began to emerge. The community, once fractured by fear and apathy, became something new. Neighbors who had never spoken before began sharing coffee. On porches, parents formed neighborhood watch groups. Volunteers organized lawn care for elderly residents. Children chalked "Welcome Home, Mr. Caleb" on sidewalks. The entire block began to shift, not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually. They weren't just repairing a neighborhood, they were rebuilding trust. And Caleb, he never ran for the board. He did not need to. He had already led the most important mission of his life. He had brought his platoon back, not to fight, but to restore. He had turned betrayal into reform. He had taken back his home, not just the walls and roof, but the soul of it. And though the legal case against Barber would take months to conclude, one thing was already certain: the HOA would never again act without accountability. Because now, the community was watching. From warfighter to watchdog, a community transformed. Days that followed the public exposure of the HOA's corruption were unlike anything the neighborhood had ever experienced. The quiet, suburban development that once prided itself on uniform lawns and silent compliance now buzzed with a new kind of energy, one fueled by a shared sense of justice, resilience, and accountability. Front yards, once isolated by invisible fences of indifference, had become gathering spaces for dialogue and cooperation. Porch lights stayed on longer into the night. Conversations that once tiptoed around HOA politics now burned with honesty, urgency, and purpose. For the first time in years, the homeowners weren't just residents, they were guardians of their own community. Caleb Monroe watched all of this unfold with a bittersweet heart. He had never intended to become a symbol. He didn't seek attention, headlines, or applause. All he ever wanted was to come home to the place he had paid for with sacrifice, dedication, and unwavering belief in the American promise. But what he had gotten instead was a war on domestic soil, not of bullets and bombs, but of deception, paper trails, and betrayal from those who were supposed to protect. Yet in facing that, he had become something more than a returning soldier. He had become a force of change, a reluctant leader, a man whose scars both visible and hidden had become the very blueprint for rebuilding something greater than himself. The newly reformed HOA board, now comprised of volunteers from every walk of life, held its first public planning session under the community's central gazebo. It was symbolic, moving away from the sterile conference rooms of the past and into the heart of the neighborhood. Caleb sat quietly at the back, but his presence loomed larger than any voice. They began by tearing down the outdated bylaw clauses that had been used as weapons. No decisions regarding property occupation may be made in the absence of the deed holder, without notarized consent or military deferment exemption, one new rule read. Another ensured that all board meetings would be recorded and distributed to every homeowner, along with quarterly audits of community finances. But it wasn't just about policies. It was about healing. Lenny and Marcus helped organize a town hall open McKnight called Stories from the Porch, where residents could speak freely about their experiences with the HOA. And speak they did. One woman tearfully shared how she was fined for leaving her garbage bin out in our past collection time on the day her husband died. Another man, a former truck driver, revealed that while he was out of state for long-haul deliveries, the HOA penalized him for lawn neglect and threatened foreclosure. The stories came like a flood, washing away years of silence and frustration. But they also carried something more powerful, hope. Because with every story shared, there was someone there to say, that shouldn't have happened, and more importantly, it won't happen again. Meanwhile, Caleb's civil complaint against Barber moved through legal channels with steady momentum. The evidence was airtight: financial fraud, abuse of authority, unauthorized use of HOA funds, embezzlement, public deception, and perhaps most devastating for Barber, a federal inquiry launched due to the misuse of a deployed soldier's property under the Service Members Civil Relief Act. The consequences would come, but Caleb did not obsess over them. He had handed the burden of punishment to the system. His focus now was on something else entirely: protecting others from what he had endured. With Darren's help, Caleb began consulting with veteran support organizations across Texas. They created a new outreach initiative called Stand Guard, designed to educate service members on their property rights during deployment. They held workshops, provided legal templates, and developed a database of HOA clauses to watch for in military-heavy communities. Caleb even testified via video conference to a Texas House subcommittee on residential law reform. His story, his calm but unwavering delivery, and his emphasis on peace through preparation caught the attention of lawmakers and news outlets alike. He wasn't angry anymore. He was resolved. Back in the neighborhood, something extraordinary began to happen. People stopped waiting for problems to rise before acting. The HOA became proactive. Monthly newsletters didn't just list rules, they highlighted community events, local veterans, and helpful resources. A community watch team was formed not to police, but to assist. They checked in on elderly residents, offered rides to medical appointments, and volunteered to mow lawns for families in crisis. Teenagers who once viewed the HOA as the enemy were now part of neighborhood youth committees, helping plan events and run food drives. Caleb was invited to speak at the community's first Service and Sacrifice Day, where residents honored veterans, healthcare workers, and teachers. And yet, amid all this, Caleb never sought praise. He still lived simply, still kept his boots by the door, and still started his day with quiet reflection on the porch. The broken pieces of his past, his sister's letter, his warped medals, his cracked photograph had been cleaned, framed, and placed on his mantel, not as symbols of pain, but as reminders of the cost of complacency and the power of rising when knocked down. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the neighborhood glowed in the amber light of dusk, Mrs. Paley walked over with a pie in hand. "You changed everything, Caleb," she said gently, placing a wrinkled hand on his shoulder. "This whole place, it feels alive again." He smiled. "I didn't change it. We all did." She nodded, then added with a soft laugh, "Well, we might have needed a bit of a kick from someone who's jumped out of planes and stared down Taliban fighters." That night, Caleb sat on his porch, watching families walk dogs, kids ride bikes, and couples stroll with fingers entwined. There was no more fear, no more hushed resentment, just life messy, imperfect, and finally, free. He had fought many battles in his life, but this quiet revolution in a sleepy neighborhood was the one that mattered most, because he had learned that sometimes the strongest kind of warfighter is the one who lays down their weapon, picks up a pen, and chooses to lead not through power but through example. And from that point on, no one in that community would ever take a soldier's silence for absence again. When the uniform comes off, but the mission continuous courthouse was quiet that morning, almost reverent in its stillness, as if the old stone building itself understood the weight of what was about to unfold within its walls. The proceedings were not sensationalized or grand, but there was a quiet current of anticipation in the air. Reporters milled outside, neighbors stood in silent groups on the sidewalk, and Caleb Monroe, dressed not in fatigues but in a simple button-down and slacks, walked up the courthouse steps with the same calm determination he once carried into combat zones. His boots weren't laced for battle, today they were laced for closure. It had taken months for the case to build, layers of legal intricacy, interviews, audits, testimonies, each revealing more about the twisted network of lies that Clifton Barber had engineered. Misappropriation of funds, fraudulent leasing of military homes, tampering with HOA votes, and failure to disclose financial interests, all of it documented and undeniable. Caleb hadn't pressed charges out of spite, but out of necessity. If it could happen to him, a combat-tested, law-abiding, dues-paying resident, it could happen to anyone. Justice wasn't revenge, it was a safeguard, and this trial would ensure the locks were reset on doors Barber had once walked through freely. Inside the courtroom, Caleb sat in the front row. He didn't speak during the trial. He didn't have to. His statement had already been submitted, clear, firm, and impossible to ignore. Instead, he watched as the prosecution presented evidence, as Darren's legal team flawlessly deconstructed the false leases, and his whole financial records were used like weapons, slicing through any remaining doubts. The defense tried to paint Barber as a misunderstood leader, a man overwhelmed by responsibility. But the jury wasn't moved. Barber's own words, recorded in secret meetings, painted him clearly arrogant, entitled, and smugly confident that no one would ever question him. The verdict came before noon, guilty on all charges. Clifton Barber would face restitution, jail time, and permanent disqualification from ever managing public or private housing associations again. As the courtroom murmured with the sound of finality, Caleb didn't smile. He didn't cheer. He simply nodded, as if acknowledging a chapter finally closing. Outside, residents stood waiting. Some clapped quietly, some simply reached for his hand. No words were needed. The neighborhood had found its voice, and Caleb had been its echo when no one else dared to speak. But justice was only one piece of the puzzle. Back home, life had returned to a new kind of normal. The HOA now operated with transparency, its minutes posted online, its meetings streamed live. Residents who once felt powerless were now empowered, attending monthly sessions, contributing to neighborhood initiatives, and holding each other and themselves accountable. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, honest, alive, and Caleb, he had quietly declined all offers to run for HOA president or even serve in an official role. He knew his strength wasn't in governance, it was in resilience. Instead, he took a quieter path, mentoring. Every Wednesday evening, he hosted informal porch sessions on his front steps, open to any veteran, service member, or neighbor who needed a place to talk. Sometimes 5 people came, sometimes 15. Some spoke about bad deployments, others about struggling marriages, lost parents, or just the exhaustion of life. Caleb listened. He didn't try to fix everything, he just showed up. And that, it turned out, was exactly what people needed. One night, during one of those sessions, a young soldier named Malik sat beside Caleb, staring off into the dusklit street. He had just returned from his first deployment and was struggling to reintegrate. "I feel like no one understands what it's like," he whispered. "Like I'm back, but I'm still stuck somewhere over there." Caleb looked at him for a long moment, then said, "Yeah, I used to feel that way too. Then they rented out my house without asking, and I thought I don't belong anywhere anymore. But I realized something. We carry the fight wherever we go, not because we're broken, but because we know what it means to lose what you thought was safe. So we protect it, we rebuild it, and eventually, we find our footing again. Malik nodded, eyes wet, and said, "You think I'll feel like I'm home again someday?" "You will," Caleb replied, "but it won't be because someone handed it to you. It'll be because you built it, inch by inch, choice by choice." That was the night Caleb realized his uniform may have come off, but the mission hadn't ended. His battlefield had changed, but his purpose hadn't. He wasn't fighting against people anymore. He was standing for them. Weeks later, Caleb received a letter in the mail, not from the government or a law firm, but from a teenage girl named Eliza who lived 3 houses down. Her father had once been fined by the HOA for non-compliance during a time when he was recovering from surgery and unable to mow the lawn. She wrote about how they had once feared the HOA, how they had considered selling their house. But now, because of Caleb, she felt proud of her street again, safe included. She ended the letter with a hand-drawn picture of Caleb standing with a cape on, in front of his home, with a dog beside him and tiny words scribbled across the sky, "Welcome home, hero." He kept that letter on the fridge. It reminded him that sometimes the greatest battles are won not in distant deserts or foreign valleys, but right here, where families sleep and children grow and people learn to believe in fairness. Again, the story of Caleb Monroe wasn't about retaliation. It wasn't about punishing those who wronged him. It was about rebuilding quietly, faithfully, patiently. He had returned from a war to find that the place he called home had been violated, but he didn't burn it down. He rebuilt it stronger. He turned neighbors into allies, silence into resistance, and one man's betrayal into an entire community's awakening. And as he sat once more on his porch, boots unlaced, sun dipping low, the world around him alive with laughter, breeze, and peace, he knew that he had truly returned, not just to a house, but to a home. The quiet hero who reclaimed a neighborhood a full year had passed since the letter that turned the neighborhood upside down, a full cycle of seasons, of porch lights flickering on and off, of kids riding bikes and chalking messages onto sidewalks, of lawnmowers humming and barbecues smoking and neighbors waving like neighbors should. It was a quiet Saturday morning in early spring when Caleb Monroe stood barefoot in his backyard, staring out at the small garden he had replanted from scratch. Lavender, rosemary, a line of sunflowers just beginning to sprout, all planted with care, each root a small defiance against what had been taken from him. The silence wasn't the lonely kind anymore. It was peace earned, honest, lasting. Much had changed, yet Caleb remained the same in all the ways that mattered. He still rose early. He still took long walks around the block. He still volunteered on Saturdays, sometimes with the local Veterans Center, sometimes with the neighborhood cleanup crew, quietly picking up trash, fixing fences, or helping elderly residents with repairs. He wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. The mission had changed. It had grown beyond him after Barber's conviction and the installation of the new HOA board. A new precedent had been set, not just legally, but culturally. The bylaws had been rewritten with language that protected the absent, the vulnerable, and the overlooked. A subcommittee had been created specifically for military families and elderly homeowners, ensuring that every vote, every rule change, and every property-related decision was made with transparency and respect. No more silent evictions, no more secret leasing, no more manipulation dressed up as policy. The neighborhood had learned a painful lesson, and it refused to forget. Caleb was no longer the lone soldier fighting for justice. He was now one voice in a community choir, one that had learned to speak up, ask questions, and stand for each other. It wasn't utopia. Disagreements still happened. Tempers still flared during HOA meetings. But gone was the fear. Gone was the blind obedience. People knew now that silence could be dangerous and that speaking up wasn't rebellion. It was responsibility. On Memorial Day, the community surprised Caleb with something he never expected. A permanent plaque mounted at the entrance of the neighborhood park, engraved in bronze with the words, in honor of Staff Sergeant Caleb Monroe, for reminding us that true leadership is measured not by power, but by integrity. Below it, in smaller text, a quote from his original letter: "Is this the community we wanted to build, one where power prays on the absent, or one where we stand for each other when no one else will?" Caleb stood before the plat that day, unsure of how to feel, humble to a fault. He had never sought recognition, but as he stood there, surrounded by dozens of residents, veterans, children, and elders alike, he realized this wasn't about him anymore. This was about legacy, not in the grandiose sense, but in the way a quiet seed becomes a tree, the way a single stand becomes a movement, the way one man's refusal to be trampled became an entire neighborhood's awakening. That evening, as golden light spilled across porches and mailboxes, Caleb sat on his steps with his old friend Diego. They didn't speak much, they never needed to. But after a while, Diego asked, "You ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't come back early?" Caleb didn't answer right away. He watched a kid ride a scooter down the block, watched a mother plant herbs outside her window, watched a teenage boy walk an elderly woman's dog with care. Then he replied, "Yeah, I think about it a lot, and then I remind myself it's not about what would have happened. It's about what we made happen." Diego smiled, nodding slowly. "You ever gonna move on from here?" Caleb looked around. The trees, the people, the laughter in the air. "No, this is home." And it truly was, because it wasn't just a house. Reclaimed, it was dignity restored. It wasn't just an HOA exposed, it was a culture transformed. And it wasn't just Caleb's life that had changed, it was everyone's. He had lit a flame not to burn bridges, but to warm a village long grown cold. He had come back from war expecting to rest. Instead, he had led his platoon into one more. Fight not with guns, but with words, law, and decency. And in doing so, he had reminded the world of a truth often forgotten, that even in the quietest corners of America, battles for justice rage, and sometimes all it takes to win is one man who refuses to look away. So when the sun finally set over that quiet, transformed neighborhood, and the breeze carried the faint scent of jasmine and barbecue, and the porch lights blinked on like stars along the street, Caleb leaned back in his chair, looked up at the sky, and allowed himself to exhale. The war was over, and the hero, he was home.